The last day of death row, Michael James Perry. Triple killer or wrongfully executed. Hi everyone. On July 1st, 2010, Michael James Perry woke up to a day unlike any other, a day he would not outlive. Just 28 years old, Perry had spent nearly a decade on death row for one of Texas's most chilling crimes, the cold-blooded killing of a woman who once opened her home to him and two young men who simply crossed his path. But as the clock ticked down, a different version of Perry emerged, one that wept, forgave, and reached for a final connection with the mother who never stopped loving him. Was this a last-minute redemption, or just another performance? In a death chamber, where silence speaks louder than screams, Perry's final 24 hours reveal a haunting collision of past sins and last chances. What really happened behind those prison walls? And can a final act ever erase the terror that came before? Let's retrace the final hours of Michael James Perry. Dear friends, as the sun rose over Huntsville, Texas, on July 1st, 2010, Michael James Perry faced the final stretch of a journey that had begun in horror and ended in silence. At just 28 years old, he had already spent nearly a decade behind bars, most of it in the concrete isolation of Texas's death row. But the story didn't begin in a cell. It began with a troubled boy, a broken path, and a choice that would devastate multiple families and stain the quiet community of the Woodlands forever. Michael Perry's early life was fractured from the beginning. Born in 1982, he was given up for adoption shortly after birth. Carlton and Sandra Perry, a suburban couple, took him in, trying to provide him with the love and stability he never had. But by all accounts, Michael was a restless child, quick to anger, impossible to calm, and nearly immune to discipline. Despite therapy, medication, and multiple interventions, his behavior worsened. He ran away. He lashed out. He used drugs and stole cars before he was old enough to vote. Juvenile detention centers became more familiar than classrooms, and by the time he turned 19, Michael wasn't just troubled, he was dangerous. In October 2001, Perry and his friend Jason Burkett devised a deadly plan. They wanted money, drugs, and an escape route, and they believed they could get all three by taking a red Camaro parked in front of a home they once knew well. That home belonged to Sandra Stotler, a kind, generous woman who had previously opened her doors to Michael when he had nowhere else to go. But on that October day, her kindness was repaid with bullets. When Sandra refused to hand over her car keys, Perry shot her. Point blank. She died in her own home, murdered by a young man she had once fed and sheltered. But it didn't stop there. Later that night, Perry and Burkett lured Sandra's 16-year-old son Adam and his friend Jeremy Richardson to a secluded area. There were no arguments, no warnings, just two more senseless killings. The boys were shot and their bodies dumped, all for a stolen car, a few credit cards, and a belief that they could outrun the consequences. But Perry didn't get far. He was arrested just days later. Security footage placed him at local stores using Sandra's credit cards. Witnesses saw him driving her car. And when officers finally found him, Perry didn't act like someone whose life had just ended. He laughed. In fact, that disturbing laugh would echo throughout the entire legal process. In court, Perry showed no remorse. He smiled. He joked. He even laughed during testimony about the killings. At one point, he seemed almost amused by the entire trial. The courtroom was filled with the sobs of victims' families, but Perry sat stone-faced or smirking. When the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death by lethal injection, he didn't flinch, and he didn't apologize. His co-defendant, Jason Burkett, received life in prison. Perry, however, would wait for years as the legal system processed appeal after appeal. His lawyers argued that he suffered from mental illness, that his upbringing had been traumatic, and that new evidence might change everything. But those arguments fell flat, one by one. As the years passed, Perry's story changed little. He maintained his innocence, sometimes insisting he had been framed, sometimes suggesting he had been coerced. In a 2011 documentary titled Into the Abyss, directed by Werner Herzog, Perry appeared calm, thoughtful, even spiritual. But outside the prison walls, the victims' families saw a man who had never truly taken responsibility. By 2010, Perry's appeals were exhausted. The state of Texas scheduled his execution for July 1st. And on that morning, the death watch began. At 5 a.m., Perry awoke inside his holding cell at the Walls unit. This wasn't like his old cell. It was smaller, quieter, and just steps from the execution chamber. He didn't react much at first. No cries, no protest, no resistance. When breakfast came, scrambled eggs, oatmeal, toast, and milk, he picked at it out of habit, not hunger. He spoke briefly with the prison chaplain. They prayed, exchanged a few quiet words, and Perry returned to silence. Hours ticked by in slow motion. At 12:30 p.m., the only visitor of the day arrived, his mother, The moment she entered, witnesses saw a shift. Perry's eyes welled with tears. His posture softened. Through the glass, she held his hand. They spoke for a short while. No one knows exactly what was said, but observers noted that Perry didn't argue or protest. He listened. He nodded. He cried. And when it was time for her to leave, he didn't watch her go. He simply stared at the floor, motionless. By 3:30 p.m., the final meal was served. Perry had asked for something specific: 3 bacon, egg, and cheese omelets, 3 chicken enchiladas, and 3 sodas. 1 Pepsi, 1 Coke, 1 Dr. Pepper. He ate slowly, methodically, finishing about half the food. It wasn't indulgence, it was ritual. A final human act before the machine took over. At 5:40 p.m., the execution team arrived. Perry stood without resistance. He wore a simple white uniform and slip-on shoes. As he was led to the chamber, the hall fell silent. Behind the glass wall, his mother and aunt stood on one side. On the other, the family of Sandra Stotler. Her daughter clutched a photograph of her mother, determined to see justice done. Once strapped to the gurney, Perry was asked for final words. His voice shook as he spoke. "I want everyone to know what's involved in this atrocity. They are forgiven by me." He paused, trying to hold back emotion. "Mom, I love you. I'm coming home. Dad, I'm coming home." Then the sedative entered his bloodstream. His eyes closed. He gasped, then fell still. One tear slid down his cheek. At 6:17 p.m., Michael James Perry was pronounced dead. No cheers, no victory, just silence. On paper, his execution was the 14th in Texas that year. But for the families in that room, it was not a number. It was a moment. A complicated, agonizing, and final one. Sandra Stotler's daughter, Lisa, later told reporters, "I needed to see if he was the monster I built him up to be. Apparently, he is." For Perry's mother, no justice could undo the pain of watching her son die, or of living with what he had done. In the end, this was not a story about closure. It was a story about choices. Some made in anger, others in silence. It was about a young man who had once laughed in court, but cried before dying, and about the lives shattered long before the execution ever took place. As the sun finally dipped below the Texas horizon on July 1st, 2010, silence fell over Huntsville. Michael James Perry was gone, declared dead at 6:17 p.m., but the ripple of his actions continued. For the families he tore apart, the execution didn't erase the pain. For his mother, it marked the heartbreaking end of a long, lonely road, one filled with confusion, sorrow, and unanswered prayers. Perry's final words offered forgiveness and love, but for many, they came far too late. His story is a grim reminder that behind every headline lies years of trauma, decades of grief, and scars that never truly fade. Whether you saw a monster or a broken soul, one truth remains. 3 lives were stolen in cold blood, and justice, however defined, took its course. In the end, there were no winners, only echoes of what might have been, and the quiet that follows a life extinguished by the state.